Good morning and welcome to this webcast. We are glad to have you join us for Students' Pronouns and Preferred Names, class rosters that promote belonging and inclusion. Hello there, I'm your host Jennifer Wicks, coming to you live from Central Station U Studio here at the Office of the Chancellor. We want to let you know today's session is captioned, so you'll see captions appear in just a moment here as we switch over to this next screen. We will be offering a resource after this live webcast. So we won't be offering the PDF of the PowerPoint today, but we will be able to mail that out after the fact, and we'll also be able to include some information regarding links that we'll be asking you for, some resource links at the end of the session as well today to be able to share with our CSU community in regard to the subject today. Well, thank you for filling out the polls. We have people joining from across the system, as you can see in poll number 1 here, just to the right of my camera. And what is your role in your department on your campus? Thank you for answering that as well. Helps us get to know who's online with us today. Number 3, do you introduce yourself with gender pronouns? It looks like 75% or so are saying no, 25% are in fact doing so, and most people are joining the webcast alone at their computer. We will have an anonymous or confidential private Q&A chat pod today, so we want to make sure that you're welcome to just put in any kind of comment or question you have. I know sometimes this topic, it's a little bit new-ish, and we want to make sure everybody's very comfortable with asking any question, making any comment that they want, and we'll see your own comments in that private Q&A anonymous chat pod there, and then we'll be able to answer those. So let's take a moment and look at our footprint savings pod. If you could just click on the top right of the screen where it says Refine My Location, and that will open up a window on your screen that will allow you just to type in the zip code from where you're joining us today. And you can also type in the number of people just by dialing up the number of people in your group if you are in a group today. We have 3 of us here in the studio, so I'm going to go ahead and dial it up to 3 and make sure that that zip code is typing in, and then click on Update Map and Save and Close. And that will bring us all back to the main screen here. We can see the accumulated savings for actually having this webcast today. So you can see so far we have over 19,000 pounds of CO2 saved, and this is whether you would fly or drive to us here at the Office of the Chancellor. Over 28,600 US dollars saved, and over 35,400 round-trip miles. So thank you for updating your location. I'd like to introduce you to the presenters here for today's session. Lolo Hong joined the California State University Chancellor's Office as Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management on August 1st this year, after serving 5 years as Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management and Title IX Coordinator at San Francisco State. Other senior roles include Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, Assistant Vice President and Dean of Students at Shepherd College, Dean of Students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dean of Student Affairs for Arizona State University's West Campus. She started her career at Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge, as a health educator. Lolo has taught courses in several disciplines: kinesiology, education, psychology, and criminal justice. She was Associate Professor of Women's Studies at ASU and earned tenure as Associate Professor in Public Health Leadership and Education while at Hilo. Darlene Dacklin is also joining us here in studio. She's the Director of Academic and Student Affairs Business Systems at the California State University Chancellor's Office. In this capacity, she supports the technology efforts of the Division of Academic and Student Affairs, which also includes collaborating with CMS Central on modifications to the PeopleSoft Student Information System. Before coming to the Chancellor's Office, Darlene worked at CSU Long Beach, where she was the Assistant Director of Graduate Admissions and Graduation. So with that, I'd like to welcome our presenters today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lolo and Darlene.
Terrific. Jennifer, thank you. Aloha mai kako. This is wonderful to be in community with all of you today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us when it's so close to the holiday coming up next week. We're hoping that we can have a robust discussion to the extent you can do that in this setting, but I think we've already got some great questions. And Darlene and I are really looking forward to the conversation with you and know that this is the beginning, and we hope that we'll be able to continue going forward. Before we kind of jump into the content of today's webinar, I did kind of want to frame the discussion a bit for us. as a community of educators. This ultimately is a conversation that contributes to our ongoing work to promote equity, inclusion, and social justice across all 23 campuses of the California State University. And with that in mind, I think it's so important to note that in the end, there is no expertise in social justice that any one of us can ever accumulate, even in a lifetime. Social justice, I think, is most fairly characterized as an ongoing, lifelong journey of learning and growth, and that we're going to be in continuous self-awareness, development of consciousness, and development of capacities to improve our ability to be agents of social justice change. But in the end, it's a journey that we have to walk with humility as we continue to be learners, and the range of identities and the complex intersectionalities that guide our everyday lives and interactions with each other is almost endless. So I just wanted to note that we here in the Chancellor's Office do not want to position ourselves as experts either. We're also on our individual respective journeys of lifelong learning. So it's in that spirit that Darlene and I are going to co-facilitate our session today and again, spark a conversation about how we can do better by our students across the CSU. So I wanted to start by framing why it's so important to talk about this issue. And I think there's two strong components. There are certainly compliance issues that we have to think about as a university. That's first, but certainly actually not the most important. So I do want to start with that. We do have a policy imperative. Our CSU executive orders, which apply to all 23 campuses, and that includes 95, 96, and 97, all prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity or gender expression. And so that is across the board, and that is something that needs to guide our efforts both in and out of the classroom. But more importantly, there's an educational and moral imperative. So there are several documents and sources that we can refer to in that regard, but I thought it would be helpful to reference Chancellor White's commitment to inclusive excellence, which was just recently introduced in January 2018. That's available on the webpage, and I've noted the URL where you can access that. And I think it's just a good reminder that for all of us committed to higher education, that we know that students who are more active and engaged learners are students who know that they feel embraced and included in the entire range of settings that happen on our campus communities. So that is why we thought it was important to kind of focus on this and why the system has made an investment in changing some of our technology resources to align with these goals. I do want to reference the U.S. Department of Education Dear Colleague letter that was issued in May 2016. This letter was pulled back. I want to emphasize that when the new U.S. Department of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos came into office, a number of the Dear Colleague letters that guided campus practices around Title IX issues were withdrawn. But Chancellor White very clearly stated in written communication to the entire CSU that despite those letters being withdrawn, we were committed as a system to holding ourselves to the higher standards that were outlined in those various Dear Colleagues letters. So I wanted to highlight some of the elements that were in that May 2016 Dear Colleague letter that are very relevant. And I think in some ways, I think Darlene led us on this journey to institute changes in the student information system. And so this letter basically reiterated that we owe and are obligated to provide civil rights protections for transgender students. It also indicated that we cannot treat transgender students differently from the way that we treat other students of the same gender identity. And then this also was really key: no medical diagnosis or treatment requirement that students must meet can be used as a prerequisite for them to be treated and regarded consistent with their gender identity. These may seem like very simple concepts for some of us, but these were really powerful when this Dear Colleague letter came forward. And as I said, this was helpful for us in catalyzing some of the changes that we're going to talk about in our webinar today. Some other elements that the Dear Colleague letter outlined: that requiring students to produce identification documents to reflect their gender identity in order to treat them consistent with their gender identity is actually a violation of Title IX, since doing so has the effect of limiting or denying students equal educational access. And part of this is recognizing is that the laws and policies and procedures across the states vary greatly in terms of what's needed for a student to produce identification or be able to apply for new identification. So this is why the Dear Colleague letter emphasize the importance of not requiring this as a quote-unquote gateway or barrier for gender identity inclusion. And then finally, and again, this is something that I think many of you working on the campuses have already faced this as a leadership challenge. We have to provide our transgender students equal access to educational programs, activities, even when students, other students, parents, community members, alumni, legislators, etc., whoever it is, raises objections or concerns. We are bound by and do need to provide that equitable access. And if other folks are feeling uncomfortable because this challenges their personal values, we do have to address that, but it can't be done at the expense of our transgender students or other students who don't fit on the gender binary. So these are just some important principles that I think are important to guide, and as I say, triggered and catalyzed in all our ways our efforts to change some of the student information system options. Some of this I recognize may be new or reviewing information that some of you know, but we recognize there are a lot of you registered on the webinar for today, and some of the questions that we got preceding today's webinar indicated that there's probably a range of knowledge and background. So I thought it might be helpful to have just a brief primer or overview. There's obviously many ways to talk about gender, both in the academic or non-academic setting, but I thought this might be just helpful to have a couple slides that lay out some basic concepts. Gender identity refers to an individual's internal sense of being male or female, some combination of male or female, or neither male nor female. It's really important to talk about the fact that gender identity is not a choice. So similar to how in our efforts to make sure that we created inclusive and welcoming communities for our students who identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, we also had to overcome that challenge of people thinking that that was a quote-unquote lifestyle preference. Gender identity is very much core to how people see themselves and regard themselves, and it's important that we recognize that this is not a choice that's just easily fungible, etc. This is part and core to who we are as individuals in our day-to-day interactions with each other. And so within gender identity, here are two common terms, and cisgender refers to situations in which a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex that person was identified as having at the time of birth. Transgender would be a situation where the gender identity differs from that. And so these are, again, when you may be hearing colleagues who use these terms, we just thought it would be helpful to bring these up and reference them so that we had a common point of understanding. And then gender transition, some of the questions that have come up is how do we address when gender identity changes over time? And I think that's an excellent question. And it's to understand that gender is ultimately a construct and it can change over time. And gender transition refers to that process of changing the way that you look, how people see and treat you, so that you can become the gender that you are inside, that you know is who you are. Transitioning can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't mean one thing, the same thing for all individuals. It can involve medical treatment or hormones. It does not have to. And it can involve changing your name or changing your pronouns. It can involve changing your appearance and dress. It can involve coming out to your friends and families. It can be a quick process or it can be a longer sustained process. What is important is, as educators, is how do we support our students and our colleagues who are in the process of gender transition. That is an important aspect of creating equity and inclusion, both in our classrooms and in the workplace. We're mindful that a lot of you who are on the webinar are faculty or instructors or lecturers or are just educators in general. And so there's a lot of literature out there. It's a growing body of literature about how we can create gender inclusivity in particularly the instructional setting. And so here are just a couple things to kind of consider. One guiding factor that we want to emphasize is that the process of coming to terms with one's gender identity, particularly if an individual is in gender transition, is that it can be potentially a traumatizing experience, for example, to ask all students to stand up and publicly introduce themselves and include their pronouns. And so we want to be mindful that while that is a way that some people have handled addressing the ability to ascertain what individual pronouns are, or sometimes in a work-related meeting, folks may be asking to do that. We recognize that that might be appropriate in some cases where perhaps there's already a closer knit community that's built up, but we want to acknowledge that that can be very triggering and actually feel unsafe for some of the individuals in that classroom or workplace setting. So we would like to propose and friendly suggest that there's some other ways that will be less invasive, but also allow us to get information about our students and each other to help make sure that we are inclusive and welcoming in the use of pronouns as they relate to individuals in our classroom. So giving the students a chance to share their pronouns and preferred names in a way that respect personal boundaries. I know when I was teaching, I would provide an information sheet that students would fill out. Some of you may want to use like a SurveyMonkey or some similar survey tool, but some way to get that information from students and ask them to share what their pronouns are and preferred names before class starts or before you have your first class meeting. Again, if you're trying to build a new team in the workplace, this would be a similar strategy that you can use. Introducing yourself with your pronouns. So again, in that communication, to share your pronouns, mine are she and her. I'm literally saying my pronouns are she and her in this particular case. And so sharing those pronouns is a way to role model and indicate that you're open to and welcome and recognize the salience of gender identity for each of us. And then in the classroom setting, you can have students make name tags or tents that include their pronouns. So again, this is a way that doesn't necessarily put someone on the spot for having to introduce themselves and also share their pronouns if they're not comfortable to do that in a public manner. But having those name tags and tents can help you as the instructor, but also fellow classmates and peers in that instructional setting to know what each other's pronouns are as well. The other thing too, I'm a big believer in curriculum infusion, and I realize that there are a broad range of topic areas that folks on the webinar may teach. And oftentimes there are different challenges with infusing content into the curriculum depending on the field that you're teaching in. But I find that in general, if one is creative and considers thoughtfully how this can be done or consults with colleagues who have done it in their classrooms, that this actually can be done. So infusing issues related to trans issues and content by trans people in your course whenever relevant, and also reviewing in your syllabus your intent to create an inclusive learning environment and the importance of respecting each other's pronouns is another way to do that. So in your syllabus, if you incorporate ground rules about respecting each other's pronouns and being mindful about gendered language in general, as well as including info that would be helpful for your transgender students in the resources section of your syllabus. These are just a couple examples. Some of you may have other examples of other information that you've provided, but these are usually very easy to get for your specific campus. So the location of the nearest gender inclusive restrooms. I know many of the CSU campuses now have a campus map that indicates where the gender inclusive restroom maps are. Citing what the CSU policy or your campus policy is around inclusion, equity, and or discrimination. Giving students instructions on how to change their pronouns and preferred names online. Darlene will talk about that in just a bit. And then also links and contacts for info on your campus resources. So for example, if there happens to be a gender resource center on campus, that would be great, whether it's in the student affairs row or perhaps your women's studies department on campus offers such a center. But there's so many ways in which we can directly and indirectly signal to our students that they belong in our classrooms and on our campuses, regardless of their gender identity. And sometimes doing it in the most subtle ways are the ways that get noticed most significantly. And I'm sure many of you have suggestions for that. We could actually spend a lot more time on gender pronouns, and there are more than just these three sets, but we just thought for some of you who are, this is new and you're still getting used to, just incorporating this as a simple part. Hi, my name is Lolo Hong. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management. My pronouns are she, her. So we've shared with you the three most common sets of pronouns that are oftentimes used, but we've also provided that there are a number of gender neutral pronouns that have also been created as well. And so it's interesting to see how our language is developing. The English language is developing to incorporate this increasing awareness around gender identity. So if you want to explore that more, and you may have students or co-workers who use some of these other gender neutral pronouns, so being aware of what they signal is important. So one thing that comes up is the fear of making mistakes. And I think so often in social justice work, we avoid having the conversations or engaging the dialogue because we're afraid that we are concerned about getting called out or called in for mistakes that we make. And recognizing that good intentions doesn't necessarily equate to the desired impact is a wonderful way to maintain that sense of humility. And so our guidance in the journey to creating equity and inclusion is just to remember we're human beings, we're on a journey of learning. learning, and we will make mistakes. And so I think just knowing can be simple, especially, for example, you have a student coming into office hours. What pronouns do you use? Or I find starting the conversation by using your own pronouns and role modeling that this is normal to be talking about one's gender pronouns. How would you like to be addressed? So these are all just examples of ways that you can just simply ask. And I think setting this as a norm, including things in your written materials that signal that this is just a part of how we want to acknowledge each other's full identities and intersectionalities, is very helpful. But we can make mistakes. So if you make a mistake, sometimes you realize it in the course of your own conversation, or someone else may gently or not so gently point that out to you. It's just important to acknowledge that, hey, I apologize, I used the wrong pronoun. I will be more careful next time. That showing that vulnerability and showing that in the moment willingness to be, again, a lifelong learner, I think is an important thing to role model. If other individuals use the wrong pronoun for another individual, there's an opportunity there to be an ally. And so I think a simple intervention statement such as, I think Sam uses she and her pronouns. And yes, I'm going to her house later too. Something like that can help to show that we're mindful about gender identity. It also helps to create correction, but also doesn't do it necessarily in a way that creates shame or embarrassment for the individual who made the mistake. So again, just a reminder, I can't emphasize enough that work to promote equity, inclusion, and social justice requires humility on all our respective parts, and it also requires a willingness to acknowledge that sometimes we make mistakes. So hopefully this provides some options in that regard. Because we talked about the importance of engaging in strategies to ascertain pronouns in a way that is not invasive and can respect personal boundaries and personal comfort levels and where folks are in their identity development, I'm going to turn it over to Darlene now. In the CSU, we recognize that we can use technology to help facilitate that for all of us. And so, Darlene, let me pass the baton.
Great, thank you. Welcome everyone, thank you for joining us today. So my section is really talking about what we've done in the student system, in the PeopleSoft student system, to update or allow students to provide this information, again, in a confidential way, with still some ability for administration to take a look at some things. The language that has been used, because this topic is very fluid, things have changed, and we've even gotten a few comments about some of the language that we're using in this presentation. A lot of the language, at least in the student system, was used based on at the time of development. So preferred names was 2 years ago when I think we started this journey, or 2 or 3 years ago when we started this journey. That was the preferred use of describing a name change. So again, as Lolo had said, the preferred names modification in PeopleSoft came about basically as a result of a lot of these conversations on campus related to how do we create a request system, an automated way for students to change their preferred name or name of choice in the system. Centrally, we convened a work group that had campus representatives on it and created a design of what this could look like in the student system. We vetted that through student affairs teams, Pride Center coordinators, CSSA, our California State Student Association. And as a result of that, we came up with some different updates that gives the campus some flexibility in the things that they want to maintain in the system. So one of the updates was allowing some configurability around administrative approval. Some campuses wanted to be able to see what those names were for fear of having some inappropriate names listed as a preferred name. So we created that ability to either choose to have an administrative approval process or not. We also built in the configuration of the segments of name. So a campus can decide whether they only want the student to be able to update their first name, last name, or middle name of the preferred name type. In addition, there were some changes related to some campuses didn't even want to implement this mod, or they weren't ready at the time that we delivered it to use it. So we had that configurability of turning it on and turning it off, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. And then Even our law enforcement folks weighed in on this. They were concerned about having students make changes to their name in the system. So we built in some ability to limit students from making this preferred name change in the system if they are in a situation of investigation for student conduct violations or some type of police or legal investigation. A campus has the ability to remove this access to the student. So as I said, we looked at this modification to the student system 2 years ago or 3 years ago, at least for the development piece, and then was delivered by our CMS central IT folks in August of 2017. So let's take a look at some screenshots of what this looks like. So before we even get into, or once the changes were put into your production system, into your student system, it came in turned off. And basically what that means is the checkbox for use CSU preferred name request was unchecked. Once you check it, you're turning that functionality on, and you need to configure your system. And as I said, there were choices in the system that allows you to either use an administrative approval, and you'll see a checkbox there in the screenshot, the different segments of a name, like where you on your campus would prefer to allow a student to update their preferred first name, middle name, or last name. And then that service indicator row, right, the second row there in the screenshot, if you have a service indicator or a hold for those students, again, who are on some type of investigation, you can limit them from having the ability to make name change requests. So all of this, again, is just a way for the campuses to make some decisions on their campus to configure the system for their campus or for your campus the best way. So this is the student view of their student center. So I'm a student, Sue Ann, and I'm going into my student center. And if she clicks on the names link in the personal information section of the student center, she'll be able to see her choices and make a request to change her preferred name. So currently her preferred name is Sue Ann Saylor, but by checking or clicking on that request preferred name box or push button, she can change her name and request a name change. You'll notice in some of these screenshots that there's some messaging information. So we've also built the system so that campuses can put in their own messages related to preferred name change requests. So if you want to say, if you have an approval process, you can tell the student in that message, it'll take approximately 2 days, 2 business days to confirm your request. Otherwise, you can put resource information into those messages. But this is basically a student enters in first, middle, or last name, depending on how you configure the system. They save it. And if you don't have an approval process, automatically those changes will take place. So now instead of Sue Ann, her name is Susie Saylor for preferred name in the Student Center. And then you'll see it again in the upper right. It's changed from Sue Ann's Student Center to Susie's Student Center. Preferred names were also put out onto class rosters for faculty. So if a student has a preferred name, it will be listed on the class roster. And we'll get to the pronoun section, but you'll see that as well on the class roster. But it'll show on the class roster as well as on the grade roster for our faculty. And then it will also show, if you're an advisor or have access to the advisor center, the preferred name will appear in the advisor center. So I'm going to take, I see one of the questions in our chat really quick regarding managing preferred name requests. And that is a campus decision. Typically, it probably comes out of your CMS area or your IT area when they put the information or put the software update into your production environment, or prior to that, it could come out of your student affairs area or your enrollment management area or enrollment services area. So like preferred names, pronouns was also a conversation that was happening on campuses. So our vice presidents of student affairs convened a couple of years ago also to initiate this conversation. they basically asked us to try to, again, make a request to find a way to add pronouns into the system. So we, again, convened another group of campus representatives and worked on an initial design. We sent it out again to student affairs folks, Pride Center coordinators, CSSA to vet the design. And out of that, a couple of major updates were the ability to configure pronouns and make those available to students. And then also showing those pronouns on the class roster as well as in the Advisor Center. So this was recently delivered, and I think this kind of helped trigger some of the we need training and webinars, because as a result of the vetting of the design, campuses were strongly encouraged to provide training or some type of follow-up regarding pronouns. We didn't want to deliver this into the software and then have some question come up and some unintentional consequence as a result. So campuses were strongly encouraged to provide training related to pronouns. And all of that came out of conversations that campuses had regarding this design. So again, the product was delivered, turned off, so unchecked. And so once your campus is ready to turn it on and make pronouns available to your students, you can check that checkbox, and then you have the ability, the campus has the ability to set their own pronouns. So out of the box, delivered to the campuses, are the pronouns listed on the screenshot: he, him, his, a not listed, so that students can put in their own pronouns: she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, and use name. So those are the basic ones that are that come right out of the box that we're delivering. If your campus chooses to add more, you can in this configuration. Otherwise, you can use the ones that are delivered. But this is definitely, again, a fluid topic, and so there could be pronouns out there that we are unaware of. And so if you want to add them on your campus, you can do that. So this is, again, what the student would see. So they would go into the student center. They would go into their pronouns, the pronouns update, into the personal information, and basically list or choose what pronouns they want to use. If the not listed is chosen, the box underneath will allow the student to enter in their subject, object, and possessive pronouns. And here's of what it would look like, but your list, again, could be different on your campus depending on how you configure the system. And then once they do that, they save their choice, and it will appear in other areas, like on the class roster. So Susie Saylor changed her pronouns to, or added her pronouns to they, them, theirs, and that will now appear on the class roster. So pronouns are an action by the student. So you may have students who don't have pronouns listed on the class roster or anywhere in the system. So just something to keep in mind. It may be something campuses want to consider encouraging students to do and message out to them that they have this opportunity, but it's a choice by the student to enter these in. One note that I did want to make on here is we did not include the pronouns on the grade roster. Since this wasn't the grade roster isn't really a classroom document or necessary for the classroom, we didn't add the pronouns to the grade roster. But if that becomes a need, we can definitely do that as part of some development for future development. Pronouns in the Advisor Center, we also added those. Again, if you are an advisor or have access to the Advisor Center, we added pronouns under personal data so that you can note how a student would like to be referenced. So those are the major updates of the system related to preferred name and pronouns. But we would like to encourage you, actually, if you have resources from your campus, if you could add those into the Q&A pod so that we can collect that information and share them system-wide. We'd love to do that and be able to make that available to the community. Jennifer, are there any questions that we can take a look at?
I actually see a couple.
Some questions,
Should we jump right in?
Sure.
Okay, so thank you all for the number of questions that are coming forward. So I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them specific. We've got a few here. So one I just want to address is this question of using the term chosen name versus preferred name. So I want to talk about the ever-evolving work of equity, inclusion, and social justice, and acknowledging that language is such a powerful vehicle for either advancing oppression or advancing empowerment and inclusion. And so I'm going to say that I'm one of the individuals that, in having done this work, I can see the reasons for using chosen name. I can also see the reasons for using preferred name. Part of, I think, why we use preferred name is that's how it's noted in our student information system, right, as the change and update that we've done. But it's important to note that preferred name is broader than we've linked it to a conversation about pronouns and gender identity, but that isn't the only setting in which we want to talk about preferred name and ways in which we can be inclusive. So, for example, instructors may have students who say, this is my given name, but this is my nickname, right? And so, or students who are international students don't want to actually change their given name, and they're keeping their given name as their chosen name, but then in studying here in the United States may make a mindful choice about saying, well, this is the name I prefer to use because people have trouble pronouncing my name in my native language, et cetera. So I think your choice is up to you. So if you want to use chosen name versus preferred name, what I have found is when you have this discussion, for example, with students or at the start of an educational program or at the start of your class, is talking about why are we talking about this? Why am I saying pronoun? And why am I not saying preferred pronoun? That's an important conversation to have with students and with colleagues. And why am I choosing to use the term chosen name versus preferred name? So that would be my suggestion, is that this is, again, ever evolving. A lot of this can be about how we're approaching the work. So that was one question that came up. There was another one that I really want to acknowledge, and that was some disagreement about the definition for gender identity. I'm going to say that I think our language is catching up with our awareness around identity. And so the challenge is using terms that it gets. So if you think about the definition that we started with about cisgender and transgender, it starts with defining gender identity in opposition to one's sex. So I think there was a question about, are the terms male, female, are they more about describing sex? So I'm going to say, again, that this is evolving. And so when we talk about gender identity, there are other actually terms that would be important to acknowledge. So one thing that we're being mindful in the CSU is, as we administer surveys, to make sure that on the question that asks for gender identity, that we don't engage in a gender binary, that we either leave it open-ended so the student can write in their own response. And that, I think, gets out of having to define or confine the definitions of gender identity to any set preterms. Some surveys don't allow for that. So if it requires you to do a more quantitative approach, then including a more comprehensive list that would not just be male and female, but including gender nonconforming, transgender, gender non-binary, gender queer. There's a broad list, and asking our students which terms to use, I find is always helpful. So I really appreciate that question. But I think, again, this is a situation where I think our language is growing. For me, it's having the conversation, the why, the understanding underneath of inclusion and equity when it comes to gender identity. In some ways is going to be just as important, if not more important, than the specific language we do or don't use. Another question that's come up is the issue of whether pronouns and preferred names are just for students who identify as LGB. And I want to emphasize that oftentimes on our campuses, issues around sexual orientation identity get conflated with issues of gender identity. And it's important to acknowledge all of us have a gender identity. And the gender identity is distinct from, it can be related and intersect with our sexual orientation identity, but they are not the same. And so each of us has a gender identity, regardless of what our sexual orientation is, and independent of that. So I think obviously the same roots of oppression and exclusion undergirding sexual orientation, gender identity, exclusion share some common elements, as does gender discrimination. But I think that was another question we came up, is that everyone has a gender identity. And so that is important to acknowledge. Those are the questions I saw that I jotted down some answers. I'm going to turn over to Darlene while I continue to review.
There is a question about, for data purposes, how should gender choices be listed? Legally in California, non-binary has been added to kind of the construct of the binary male-female. So from a legal perspective, you'll see, at least from the CSU, we're using male, female, and non-binary. There are some additional questions, at least on the admissions application. I think they are also available in the student center regarding a student identifying their gender identity if they choose to do that. And there's some information, I think there's some choices there that are a little more specific, and those can be used. But there isn't, again, a necessary list unless you want to be consistent like within your department or within your campus of choices that you want to provide, and just use those moving forward. But there isn't a specific list. Legally, the CSU is using male, female, and non-binary to meet legislative requirements. There's another question regarding if the pronouns are only in the faculty and advisor center, or can enrollment staff see those? Yes, enrollment staff, as long as you have access to see the personal data information, you should be able to see the pronouns information as well. We're just taking a look at some of the questions.
I can jump back in with a few. Okay,
Okay.
would that work? So one was, how do we make pronoun informational training mandatory for campus constituents? This is a complicated question. And so I think it's going to depend on who the target audience is. I think certainly for those of us in the classroom setting, one of the things I'm so mindful of is the role of us as instructor and faculty member. There's so much power there. And I mean that power in a neutral or multi-partial sense of, we have the power then to say these are things that are important. And if equity and inclusion are important, we can actually literally engage conversations around identity in the classroom. So that's a very micro response. I'm going to imagine on the other end is, can we mandate training about this for every single staff, faculty, and administrator? That's going to vary. And so there are certain types of training that we can mandate that are included in our collective bargaining processes. MPPs can always be mandated for training. And so I would say every administrator, if we wanted to say on your campus, should be getting trained, that would be important. When I was the Title IX coordinator for San Francisco State, that was actually our Title IX trainings, is where we made sure we consistently included information around gender identity and gender identity inclusion. So I think this is something that each campus needs to discuss relative to their conversation, but certainly student organizations, student clubs, all of these are things that the range of choices are just going to vary in terms of what you think is important and what you value. So I wanted to raise that. The other one that's important is, how about for staff and faculty? So this came up shortly after we instituted these changes in the student information system. So my understanding is that in the human resources information system, they are also moving forward. So they're a little bit behind compared to our work to support this for students. But I know that that work is in project, and that may be in different stages on your campus. So we would encourage you to ask your campus senior human resources officer for status on where they are.
Can I jump in on that? I think they do want to tie it to the CHRS project as well. So from a consistent or system-wide solution, they're probably waiting until your campus goes live on CHRS, but that doesn't mean that something could potentially happen on your campus locally. Another question was preferred names on student degrees or on diplomas. And actually, I believe this is a conversation that's happened with registrars. Some campuses allow students to put in a diploma name, so that would appear on the degree. But again, this is also a campus decision. This is not something that's coming from the chancellor's office in terms of what's being determined on diplomas. There was another question, I believe, regarding how the changes in the PeopleSoft student information system communicate with Canvas or other learning management systems. Learning management systems are managed on the campus. So if Canvas or Blackboard or Moodle allow multiple names within their systems, then you can pull in all the names from PeopleSoft into those learning management systems. I think I've heard also you can go probably into Canvas as a student and make some changes to your profile and change your primary name to preferred name. But it would have to be a integration that happens on the campus. We have not done anything centrally to move that information into learning management systems.
Darlene, do we get the changing the email address?
We didn't.
Okay, so let me tackle that. That I think is also going to vary from campus to campus because student email addresses are signed at the campus level. So that would be a great question to go back and talk to your IT colleagues about their specific policy. So for example, at San Francisco State, if we had a student who was experiencing stalking and it was happening as cyber stalking, there was a very compelling need to change and update their student email address. And so we could certainly make that happen. So I think in general, the question is, can student email addresses be updated? I think the broader issue is that process automated, how difficult it is? It's also how email addresses are constructed. In some cases for students, a change in name or preferred name or chosen name won't necessarily not show up, right? So for example, if the first initial is the same and the last name is not being changed, depending on how the address is constructed, it may not need to change. So that I think is going to be campus based on what their policies are. And again, this might be a good opportunity to say, hey, in our efforts to be gender inclusive, can this policy also be examined at the campus level?
All right. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any more on the board.
Yeah, and I think we've gone through the ones that I have from prior.
We touched on the question about the name changes, how they appear on the transcripts.
No, I think, again, that would be a campus decision.
Okay.
Typically, or at least conversations with within the registrars, is that it's the primary name appears on transcripts because it is a legal document that a student can use in other forums for jobs and things like that. So my understanding is primary name, but again, that could be a conversation on campus.
And somebody here provided a resource, so thank you very much. The Gender Recognition Act, SB 179, outlines 12 gender identities under the non-binary umbrella category. So thank you
Wonderful.
for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cal Poly, appreciate that.
Did we get to all the questions? I think
Let's
so.
see. A few more
It's
links.
scrolling quickly, so I can't tell what we got and what we didn't get.
There's a
Darlene.
lot here. There's a lot here. Let's see here. We're receiving a few other links, so thank you. We will be sure to include those on a list and send out to everyone.
And I'm seeing a question about getting a copy of the PowerPoint presentation today. Yes, we will do that. We want to make sure that we provide an accessible document, so we will take care of that and distribute that to all the participants for today.
We got that one.
Okay, we have a question about name versus pronoun. Do they accomplish the same thing? No, because I think, so the issue of students' name has come up for a long time. And again, the example I use is I remember getting requests from students, for example, who would ask, I have a different name because I'm an international student, or they have a nickname. And so the issue of a student's chosen or preferred name can be related to, but is not the same as their pronouns. And so it is important to ask for both. So when I do my student information sheets, when I ask for both, I'm looking for different kinds of information. They may or may not be related for a particular student. So I think it is important to include both.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There were a lot of questions in that one particular comment.
Yeah, okay, so that has multi-layers. I'm gonna ask this question. Are preferred pronouns just another layover of political correctness? Again, speaking to the fact that they are not the same thing and refer to different aspects of an individual's identity, I do not think that it's over-layering. I think they're two different aspects of a person's identity, so I believe asking both. And using gender-neutral language or in gender-inclusive language, I think is just an important aspect, because there may be students in the classroom setting or in the educational setting that are undergoing gender transition or are still questioning, and engaging in that language proactively signals that wherever they are on that continuum, they are welcomed and included in the environment. So that goes beyond, because we may not have we may not know what their pronoun is.
We have some nice comments coming in here, thanking you for being so thorough. So thank you for these nice comments from Long Beach and San Bernardino. We appreciate also your comments in the anonymous poll on the left of the screen here. People are saying they always introduce themselves with pronouns and include them in their email signature, using gender-neutral language in class, addressing students using names they want, addressing issues that relate to class, that relate to social justice. Nice.
That's great. I like the suggestion of including your pronouns on your nameplate.
Oh, yeah.
So hopefully that'll just be a standard template as we order these things. One thing I'd like to suggest, and Darlene covered this, is that right now the ability to use these two functions is not universally done. The campus does need to make that choice. So we've had situations where students on one campus, for example, at the CSSA meetings, there's variation. So students on one campus will be explaining to a student at another campus, well, this is how you change your pronoun or your name in the student information system. And the other student from another campus is going, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't find this. So I do think that this is something that if your campus has not turned on this functionality, to perhaps use this webinar as an opportunity to discuss this as a broader campus community, and discuss the importance that if we're committed to equity inclusion, inclusive of gender identity, it would be important to offer this functionality across the board, all 23. That would be my personal goal and hope that we do that. So,
and we, again, delivered it turned off so that campuses could have this conversation before turning it on, but the expectation was that you would turn it on at some point to allow students this opportunity to identify themselves.
Great, and it looks like we just have a couple more minutes, and we do have some feedback in that feedback poll beneath your webcam saying that they want more, but there just wasn't enough time. So we do have a couple more minutes. Some people are saying they have more questions, so please do type those in. We do have another comment that just came in from Northridge here. I've heard some people say it can be problematic introducing yourself with your pronouns because it forces folks to state something they may not be ready to say publicly.
So I can speak to that from the student affairs side. I know that in our field, we have debated this over and over. And so I think there are a couple ways to handle it. I think a compulsory, I think there's a little bit more opportunity to create an unsafe climate is if we're introducing in the process of introductions that it is compulsory in a group setting where I have to stand up, introduce myself, and share those my gender pronouns. And so again, you have to know your audience. If it's a group that has been together for a longer time, then I think the ability to ask folks to take a higher level of risk is going to be different from an educational or pedagogical perspective. But in the first day of class with first-time freshmen, right, if that's what you're teaching, and there's 60 students in the class, I think using opportunities that would be less invasive or less public is a helpful way to do it. When I introduce myself, one of the things that I can say to create a sense of safety and that it isn't compulsory is to just acknowledge that I used my pronouns and I shared my pronouns, that in no way conveys or implies that it's mandatory for any of you to also. I'm just sharing that because I wanted to make sure that I'm letting you know that I'm sensitive about the role of gender identity. So I think you'll have to develop your own style, but I do think that being cognizant of the audience, it is going to be to vary. I have found that in equity inclusion work, transparency and taking the time to explain and describe and discuss is so helpful, that we can't take this for granted and assume that folks are on the same learning base or information knowledge. It does take time though. So with limited time, right, in a semester and with so much content to cover, I recognize it can be challenging, but I think it's important to do.
Great, and as we come to a close here, we wanted to ask, in addition to the resources that we're asking for, links that you may be aware of that you can share with us, that we can also share with everyone else, it would be helpful to know if there are people within the CSU community who can also lead professional training.
There are several areas on campus, and we do encourage, because I think as much of this work that can be done within the campus community, among communities of the campus, can be very compelling and very powerful. So one is your institutes of teaching and learning. They may have a different name on your specific campus, but many campuses have a version of that where we focus on how do we create more culturally competent, culturally inclusive communities of belonging, welcome, and inclusion in the instructional setting. There should be, or we're moving towards a model where there is a senior diversity officer or senior equity and inclusion officer, or someone with a similar role or function. Those individuals can also be a resource. And then on many of our CSU campuses, there is a center that focuses on equity, inclusion, and diversity work, or multicultural centers on campus, where colleagues there also have a body of knowledge. And again, I want to maybe close with remembering what we started out with, is that the work of social justice requires each of us to be lifelong learners, right? To approach the work with humility, to be willing to ask for help and recognize that no one of us can be the quote unquote expert on any of these issues. So I think drawing on your community-based resources is wonderful.
Great. Well, with that, we'll bring our session to a close as we are at the top of our hour, the end of our hour. So I'd like to thank both of our presenters today, Lolo Hong and Darlene Dacklin, for sharing this session today and all of this great information. So please continue to put your comments and questions into the chat pod. We'll be collecting all of those, as well as links that we'll be sharing as resources. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much.